Times Now. Action begins here.
And joining me this evening to debate and to discuss and to tell us more about the World Bank's report on India's ease of doing business, I'm joined by the country director of the World Bank, Junaid Ahmed, joining me right here on the Poll Pulse this evening. Mr. Junaid Ahmed, thank you very much for joining me here on Times Now. Your report has sparked off quite a political controversy. But before I go to the controversy, I'd just like to ask you one simple question. India has been talking about ease of doing business for the last several years. Look at the way the rankings have gone. 2011, it was ranked 132, 2013, 134. 2014, it dipped to its lowest ever, 142, then up to 130 in 2016, and 100 is the ranking of India today. What's caused this huge jump of 30 positions for India in this year's Ease of Doing Business report?
Navika, thank you very much. Navika, when I joined the World Bank's country office in India a year ago, it was just literally a few days before last year's report came out. And last year, if you remember, the country had only gone up by one rank. I must say at that point, there were a lot of questions about the bank's methodology. Was it covering the right cities? Was it with the right data? And one could have easily seen a government saying that, this report, its methodology is not right for India. But what really took me by surprise was across the government system, there was a response back which was, we will persevere because we are on a route for reform. And we will continue and let the report see what will happen a year from now. This is a complete perseverance of a reform process that came from the Prime Minister's direct office down into the system of service delivery, into the bureaucracy. And it's this consistency and this perseverance is really what I think is paying off. But there's a second reason that I would say we are seeing a big shift from last year, one of an emphasis on coordination. The coordination is coordination between different tiers of government, but coordination across departments to make a difference on the ground. And this is a coordination that comes directly from the Prime Minister's office into the line departments. And whenever there was a difference or a need to get support from top leadership, that leadership came forward. Interestingly, we saw the same kind of coordination from high above in countries like Russia, Mexico, where this kind of shift has happened above. So to really answer your question, it's about leadership, perseverance, and keeping focus on what matters for reform.
But Mr. Junaid Ahmed, my question to you is, and you brought this up in your first statement, you said that there were problems with the methodology that the government had expressed. This problem was expressed even in the UPA government in 2013. There was a formal complaint, if you can call it that, that was registered with the World Bank on the methodology. Now, when you have done this report, has the methodology changed to try and give better rankings, or has the methodology remained the same and the response from the government that's changed?
No, the methodology, we've been doing this report for 15 years. And over the years, as we learn from the field, our methodology has changed. But what's important is whenever the methodology changes, it's exactly the same methodology across 180 countries. Methodology doesn't change for one country versus another. It's a common methodology across all countries because ultimately it's a ranking that looks at countries across the world, 180 countries. So the methodology changes as we learn. 15 years of experience, it'd be surprising that we did not learn and change the methodology, but it's one that is common across countries. And that's extremely important to remember. Otherwise, it's very hard to create a ranking or a benchmark comparing one country with another.
But Mr. Junaid Ahmed, I don't know if you follow politics at all closely, considering you are the country head of a heavily political country like India. Today, the opposition parties have charged the government, saying that these World Bank ratings are fixed. They've virtually been given on a platter to this government because the government had a deal going with you. How do you respond to that?
Navika, there's only one country's politics that I observe very carefully. That's mine, Bangladesh. So I can assure you, you can ask me any question about politics in Bangladesh, you'll get a perfect answer. Listen, this is a report that we are very proud of, that we have been doing for 15 years across the world, across different governments, across different countries. And this is the power of the report, that it is a global report with a global methodology applied globally. And that's really the importance, since that's the only way we can really do a benchmarking that crosses different countries. But the other thing which is extremely important, it's not a benchmark of economic policy across every parameters. It's very well defined. It's a well-defined parameter which I think one of the writers in India correctly said, it measures the regulatory and business cholesterol of a country. That's basically all it does. It will not talk about macroeconomics. It doesn't talk about skills, labor. It's very specific to doing business.
Mr. Junaid Ahmed, another criticism that comes in is that this ease of doing business is based out of just two cities, Delhi and Mumbai. How representative is it of the entire country and the ease of doing business in the entire country?
Well, you know, I am the first one to actually, I would love to see that we do survey across the country. I mean, India is massive. It's a region, a billion plus people across a huge landmass. But what we're trying to do, again, I have to repeat, is create a comparison that's consistent across the world. And in that context, we really have to make it doable. And what we have done is take two cities in each of the countries. If we're going to do more than two cities, it has to be done across the world. So in the future, we may actually change the methodology and include more cities. But right now, to make it a comparison across the world, we have kept it at two cities. In the case of India, the two cities are New Delhi and Mumbai. And they represent different parts of India. They represent different aspects of India. Sometimes they're very representative of the nation. Sometimes they're very unique to the two parts of the country. Similarly, if we take my own country, Bangladesh, you'll find that we're looking at the capital city, Dhaka. Or if you go to Mexico, it'll be the capital city, Mexico City. So there's comparison which is comparable, is the same type of cities across the world, because it's the benchmarking across the world that really matters.
Sir, I would like to ask you on the issue of GST, which has come up after July, which is not part of your report. In your experience, do you think the problems that are being witnessed by businesses in India ever since GST has come up in July 1 will have an impact on the ratings next year, perhaps?
Well, first, I think let's distinguish between GST and the doing business story. GST in India is being implemented to create a one unified market across the country. When GST will be fully implemented, and we're in the middle of its implementation, the impact that this one market will have on the economics of this country, in my opinion, is potentially tectonic. I think it can add several growth points in terms of the GDP. Now, anything as massive as what India is doing, because no other country has actually done this kind of a tax reform and implemented it at such a scale, the implementation is something that's going to be done in phases, and as the country learns from it, it will shift. So it'll take its time, and during that time, of course, implementation is going to cause a little bit of change in the country. What will it do to the future rankings really depends on how quickly implementation goes through and how smoothly it goes through. It may well give it a positive impact, or it may give it an impact which gives you a sense that there is a country in transition in one of the most important tax reforms that it's doing. But for me, the issue is not what DBT will pick up in a year's time. The real issue is how will GST impact on the nation as a whole? And I think that this is a bold move, and it's a bold move that's going to pay off for India in big ways.
Let me take you back to the question, Mr. Junaid Ahmed. In 2015, India's ranking was 131. In 2016, it was 130. one rank improvement in 2015 to 2016. At that time, there were no critics from opposition parties saying that this was a fixed report between the government and the World Bank. Today, what would your response to those who are questioning whether the 30 ranking leap that India has made is due to some sort of a behind-the-scenes understanding between the World Bank and India's leader, maybe Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as you said, who's been driving this entire issue? How would you respond to them?
You know, the wonderful thing about this report is that this is done by a global team with a global methodology that's based in Washington. We, all of us who are country directors or country representatives of different countries, have actually no influence over this team. We, in fact, are just simply a recipient of the report, and we report it back to you in the country. Whether it's my colleague in my country, Bangladesh, who's the country director, or it's the country director in China, or it's the country director in Mexico. This is a global team that applies the same methodology across the world. And it's a global team that works across 180 countries. It's an extraordinary effort by a multilateral institution like ours. And we've been doing this for 15 years across the world, and 15 years in India. And I think we will continue to do it with the same sense of purpose and same sense of dedication to serve the countries where we do it.
Before I let you go, Mr. Junaid Ahmed, let me just ask you on a very lighter note. You know, you must have worked in the World Bank in several other countries as well. Do you think leaders of countries, elected prime ministers and presidents use their charm somehow with the World Bank to influence these ratings world over?
I think one of the things that I've learned, I've lived in South Africa, worked in South Africa, I've lived in India, worked in India, and of course I've lived and worked in Bangladesh. Leadership matters everywhere. Change that happens is driven by leadership. I can tell you that systematically over the last 3 years, the perseverance in policy reform begins with the leadership willing to keep this moving. But the other impact that's extremely important, and one we must recognize, is the front line. The front line of India is its bureaucracy, are all the line departments. In this case, an empowered DIPP and its secretary, Ramesh Abhishek, in coordination with the secretaries across line departments, have been really taking this reform program forward. Take, for example, the Secretary Urban, whose consistent effort with the two big cities, New Delhi and Mumbai, to get some of these indicators to move. That's really what matters, and that's the leadership. But that leadership of that front line is really driven by the Prime Minister, you say? Leadership coming from above. So the one lesson that I've learned, there is no doubt that your Prime Minister has given a strict order that reform must stay going forward, must continue to go forward. And it has empowered DIPP to actually take this thing forward. What I've also really found fascinating is how many of the other countries, and including India, that whenever the front line has problems in coordinating, it can rely on the leadership to come down and say, let's get the problem solved. We've seen the finance minister coming in to solve the problems of service delivery. We've seen whenever needed, even at the Pragati meetings, the discussion very transparently has happened. This mechanism, I hope, will get institutionalized, because this kind of coordinated effort between top leadership and the front line of bureaucracy is really what makes a difference in reform. And again, we saw this in Mexico, we saw this in Russia, we saw this in South Africa. In each case, this connection between top leadership and the front line matters for reform.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Junaid Ahmed, and thank you very much for speaking exclusively here 2 times now on what you think about India's big leap on the ease of doing business rankings. Thank you very much for joining us.
Times Now. Action begins here.